Wow. Thank you all so much. Good morning again. Just a few days ago, on Ash Wednesday, we entered into the holy season of Lent. So I want to take a moment now to invite you to help me thank the people who changed out the art: Catherine Dixon, Kevin Williams, Yolanda, Calandra, Dawn, Isabel, Rebecca, the list goes on. Thank you all so much. In this time of spiritual exploration and reflection, we're going to explore a new worship theme together. During the next 6 Sundays, we will consider what it means to forge faith in a time like this, a topic Frances Willard knew a little something about. A suffragist, labor reformer, temperance activist, and self-described Christian socialist, Frances Willard was a towering figure in the 1870s through to the 1890s. She traveled the world, lobbying and teaching and preaching and organizing men and mostly women in support of her many causes. Along the way, she rubbed shoulders with presidents, politicians, and well-known pastors of her day. She attended national conventions and rallies and intersected with other activists working in the late 1890s. In fact, one of those activists, Ida B. Wells, called Willard to account when Wells noticed that in all her activism around women's rights, Frances Willard rarely spoke of civil rights for folks of color. Ida B. Wells called out how Willard and the organizations with which she was affiliated never spoke out against lynching, an issue that was very much in the public eye at that time. In response, Willard made a public statement against racism and encouraged one of her organizations to pass a resolution decrying the evils of lynching. Frances Willard had confronted all kinds of ills, from state-sponsored misogyny to her own moral political blind spots. She had perfected her public speaking skills, had learned how to interpret scripture alongside the best of them, had done things that most women of her day would never dream of doing. However, at 53, she took up a challenge that was so deep. She embarked on an adventure so profound. She set off into a wilderness that was so vast, she decided to write a book about it. The title, How I Learned to Ride the Bicycle. Before I tell you what Frances Willard had to say about the process of learning to ride a bike, let me first tell you what other people had to say about the idea of women even trying to. In general, many folks in the late 19th century thought that women, the so-called fairer sex, were too delicate to face the harsh realities of bike riding. In one newspaper article titled "Against Nature," a Chicago woman named Mrs. Kendall wrote about bicycling as a violent exercise, one that compromises a woman's natural femininity. Mrs. Kendall wrote, "When a girl gets astride of her bicycle, she bids farewell to good looks. If she develops new muscles, be sure some other part will suffer. Some faculty will be slighted. Some natural trait will be undeveloped. As for bloomers, the new style of dress bike riding women sported to avoid getting their skirts caught in the gears, they are an abomination." In addition to the abominable pants, those strangely developing muscles Mrs. Kendall argued against were thought by many to be muscles in a very specific part of the body. It was known as the dreaded bicycle hand. One columnist describes the condition this way: "It begins by a bulging out of the muscle on the side of the hand. This grows more and more prominent and gets tougher and tougher until it is as hard as a piece of wood. Then the muscles of the fingers grow larger and harder until they too are all out of shape." Frances Willard was very much aware of this taboo. It was part of the reason why it took her so long to try bike riding in the first place. 10 years prior, a woman made big waves when she decided to make a public spectacle of participating in a bicycle race. Frances Willard wrote, "She was thought by some to be a sort of semi-monster. And liberal as our people are in their views of what a woman may undertake, I should certainly have felt compromised at that remote and benighted period by going to see her ride, not because there was any harm in it, but solely because of what we call in homely phrase, the speech of people." Over 100 years later, and the so-called speech of people is as strong as ever, isn't it? How often in our lives do we let the speech of people shape our choices? Whether it's deciding to take up this adventure or that one, whether it's deciding to set off into a literal wilderness or a spiritual one, it's amazing how easy it is to get talked out of doing something different. It's the decision to go back to school when you're in the middle of another career. It's considering divorce after a decade of rocky marriage. It's deciding to take up a whole new vocation in retirement. It's choosing to try to make a relationship work even after your friend or your loved one proclaims a very different set of politics from you. It's standing up to the boss when everyone else wants to but won't. It's giving yourself permission to rest rather than keep on grinding. It's getting clean or getting sober when everyone else in your life either can't or just won't. It's learning to ride a bike in your 50s when nobody thinks you should. What we're talking about this Sunday is the decision to set out into a wilderness, an uncharted and uncertain future filled to the outer edges with change. It can be hard, can't it? It can be strange. It can be scary. And so very often we avoid it. We stay at the job we can't stand because at least it pays the bills. We stay in the marriage that doesn't work because in some ways it's just easier. We obey the demands of the unhinged leader because we're not really sure if we want to rock the boat. We think to ourselves, oh, I'm young. I've got time to try that later. Or we think to ourselves, oh, I'm far too old for that now. We hide our passions. We conceal our dreams. We quiet our call and we coast. We tread water and jog in place because the journey through the unknown is far too scary, we think. Still, of course, sometimes we don't get to choose whether we go to the wilderness because the wilderness comes to us. Sometimes great raging storms descend on our lives and destroy what's most dear and familiar. Sometimes the wilderness of an unexpected diagnosis comes. You get laid off. Your beloved partner passes away. Your child rebels in ways you didn't plan for. Retirement is a whole lot more boring than you anticipated. Your country's government starts eating itself from the inside out. Sometimes the wilderness comes whether or not we choose it. Whenever we're walking through the unknown, for whatever reason, though, one of the most powerful gifts of spirituality is this. The wilderness, while scary and confusing and largely unwanted, the wilderness is also the place where real faith gets forged. Because faith isn't something we just find. Faith is something we learn. Faith is something we create. Faith is something we forge in the fires of the wild unknown. This, after all, is how the whole story of our faith got started, according to Mark. And the good news, according to Mark, there is no baby. There is no manger. There is no Christmas like with Luke and Matthew. No, the author of Mark starts with an adult Jesus and the adult John who baptizes him. Here's how the story goes. In those days, Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. And just as he was coming up out of the water, he saw the heavens torn apart, and the Spirit descending like a dove upon him. And a voice came from the heavens, "You are my Son, the beloved. With you I am well pleased." And the Spirit immediately drove Jesus out into the wilderness. And he was in the wilderness 40 days, tested by Satan. And he was with the wild beasts, and the angels waited on him. This is in the very first chapter of Mark. Just a few verses down, without the miraculous birth, well before the miraculous healings, chapters before the walking on water, Mark makes clear that the beginning of faith's story is one long period of wilderness. One long season in a strange place, doing a strange thing, surrounded by temptations, distractions, and a couple of angels standing by to help. We return to this story, friends, year after year in this season called Lent, because life returns each of us to our own wilderness year after year too. We return to this story every Lent because Lent is that 40-day-long season in which we remember and emulate what Jesus did in his faith-forging wilderness experience. The work to reflect, to pray, and to learn how to move forward. Lent is a time, then, when we are called to confront our own wilderness, that place in our own lives riddled with temptation and anxiety and unknowns, that place where there are hints of direction but no clear paths, that place where the biggest challenge we encounter is ultimately ourselves. Sure, we may have angels at our side. We may have friends cheering from the bleachers. There might be folks who are pushing our bike along, but it is us, only us, who is pedaling, who is steering, who is driving our own life. This is, in fact, precisely what Frances Willard's book is all about. How I Learned to Ride the Bicycle isn't just an interesting story of a 50-something-year-old woman defying the expectations of her age. It's also a memoir about how this towering figure dealt with loss and grief. You see, right before Willard decided to don the abominable bike-riding bloomers, before she chose to risk the dreaded bicycle hand, her mother had passed away. Right around that same time, her work started winding down. She was, in other words, in the throes of a whole variety of unknowns and change. And learning to ride a bike then, she forged a new way to describe the task of learning how to live. Strange as the paradox may seem, she writes, you will do this best by not trying to do it at all. You must make up what you are pleased to call your mind. Make it up speedily, or you will be cast in yonder mud puddle, and no blame to me and no thanks to yourself. Two things must occupy your thinking powers to the exclusion of every other thing. First, the goal, and second, the momentum requisite to reach it. Do not look down like an imbecile upon the steering wheel in front of you. That would be about as wise as for a nauseated voyager to keep his optical instruments fixed upon the rolling waves. It is the curse of life that nearly everyone looks down. But the microscope will never set you free. You must glue your eyes to the telescope forever and a day. Look up and off and out. Get forehead and foot into line, the latter acting as a rhythmic spur in the flanks of your equilibrated equine. So, thus, in this way, you shall win, and speedily. Whatever the wilderness is for you right now, what we learn there actually is a whole new dimension of who we are. Are we people who walk through life with our heads down, focused only on the beasts and the temptations and the to-do lists right in front of us? Or are we people willing to go ahead and set a goal? No matter its scale, whatever its size, just something to hone our focus and steadily head toward, avoiding the distractions that might make us wobble off course and risk falling down. Are we people who are willing to forge faith? Faith in ourselves, faith in our friends, faith in the invisible power and love that animates all things. You know, it'd be nice if questions like these were only asked once in a lifetime. It'd be nice if the wilderness was a one-time rite of passage, but alas, it comes again and again. No matter what we've accomplished, no matter how old we might be. And so, friends, however the wilderness has shown back up for you in this time, know that you aren't alone. Among the beasts and the tempters, among the fearsome shadows and the unmarked paths, there are angels. Folks who are willing to offer care and cheer you on. Folks who won't get bogged down in the so-called speech of people. Folks who are willing to jump in the saddle and pedal beside you toward their own goals. All the way to peace. All the way to wholeness. All the way toward the power and love we call God. May it be so, and amen. Friends, we now worship God as we present our offerings.